The autumn sun barely peeked through the Seattle skyline as Jessica Thompson grabbed her travel mug, filling it with her signature French roast coffee. At 42, she had mastered her morning routine down to the minute, knowing exactly how long it took to get from her townhouse to the courthouse downtown. Today was particularly important. She had to review several judicial appointments before noon. Running her fingers through her carefully styled hair, Jessica checked her reflection one last time in the hallway mirror. Her navy blazer and pencil skirt projected the authority she'd earned through 15 years of dedicated service to the judicial system. The pearl necklace her grandmother had given her at graduation completed her professional appearance. Another day, another challenge, she muttered to herself, gathering her leather briefcase and car keys. The morning air held that crisp October freshness as she walked to her silver Lexus, parked in the driveway of her Victorian-style home. The traffic moved smoothly until she reached Madison Avenue. Jessica noticed the construction signs had changed overnight, creating confusion among drivers navigating the morning rush. She carefully maneuvered through the maze of orange cones, maintaining a safe distance from the car ahead. The light ahead turned yellow. Jessica checked her mirrors, noting she was too close to stop safely. Using her best judgment, she proceeded through the intersection just as the yellow light transitioned. Seconds later, red and blue lights flashed in her rearview mirror. Perfect, Jessica sighed, pulling over to the curb. She reached for her purse, retrieving her license and registration before the officer approached. Through her side mirror, she watched Officer Mike Parker adjust his belt as he walked toward her car, his face set in a stern expression. "License and registration," he demanded, barely making eye contact as Jessica handed over her documents. His tone carried an edge that made her grip her steering wheel slightly tighter. "Officer, I'd like to explain about the light," Jessica began, maintaining her professional composure. "The construction zone created an unsafe stopping distance, and Ma'am, I observed you running a yellow light that was clearly turning red," Officer Parker interrupted, his pen already moving across his ticket pad. "The construction zone has clear warning signs posted." Jessica took a deep breath, remembering her position and the importance of staying calm. "I understand, officer. However, if you check my driving record, you'll see I have a perfect history. I made a judgment call based on safety and..." "That'll be $275. Officer Parker cut in, thrusting the ticket through her window. "You can contest it in court if you'd like, but I clearly saw the violation. Sign here." Fighting back her frustration, Jessica signed the ticket with practiced patience. As a judicial administrator, she'd seen countless similar situations from the other side of the bench. Still, experiencing it firsthand sparked a different kind of understanding. As Officer Parker walked away, Jessica noticed he'd written "attitude" in the comments section of her copy. She checked her watch. The interaction had cost her 15 precious minutes. Merging back into traffic, she couldn't shake the feeling that something about this morning would turn out to be more significant than a simple traffic ticket. Little did she know, this seemingly routine traffic stop would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge perceptions, shift power dynamics, and ultimately lead to unexpected changes in the local judicial system. 2 weeks later, Jessica sat in courtroom 304, her laptop balanced on her knees as she responded to urgent emails. The wooden bench felt particularly uncomfortable today, and the air conditioning hummed too loudly overhead. Around her, other citizens shifted restlessly, waiting for their cases to be called. She'd chosen to wear her favorite charcoal gray suit today, not to impress anyone, but because it gave her confidence. The courtroom clerk shuffled papers at his desk, occasionally calling out names in a monotone voice that echoed through the high-ceilinged room. Traffic court is nothing new, Jessica reminded herself, having overseen hundreds of sessions from an administrative perspective. Yet sitting here as a defendant felt oddly disorienting. She watched as Judge Brandon Miller entered the courtroom, his black robe flowing behind him with an air of authority that seemed slightly forced. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and the shuffling of feet filled the room. Jessica noticed how Judge Miller barely acknowledged the crowded courtroom before taking his seat. At 38, he was one of the youngest judges recently appointed to the bench, and his demeanor suggested he was eager to prove himself. Case number 247. Jessica Thompson. The clerk called out. Jessica gathered her belongings and approached the podium, standing with the same dignity she carried in her executive meetings. Ms. Thompson, Judge Miller began, still looking down at his papers, you're here contesting a citation for running a yellow light in a construction zone. How do you plead? Not guilty, Your Honor, Jessica replied clearly. If I may explain, the construction zone created an unsafe stopping distance, and Miss Thompson, Judge Miller interrupted, finally glancing up but seeming to look through her rather than at her. Are you suggesting Officer Parker doesn't know how to properly assess a traffic violation? The condescension in his tone was unmistakable. Jessica maintained her composure, drawing from years of handling difficult situations. No, Your Honor. I'm simply stating that given the sudden changes in the construction zone and the safety considerations, the construction zone was clearly marked. Judge Miller cut in again, shuffling through the officer's report. Officer Parker noted you had an attitude during the stop. This court has zero tolerance for disrespect toward law enforcement. Jessica felt her pulse quicken, but her voice remained steady. Your Honor, I respectfully disagree with that characterization. My driving record is perfect, and Miss Thompson, this court's time is valuable, Judge Miller declared, his gavel already in hand. The fine stands at $275, plus court costs of $125. Pay the clerk on your way out. Next case. The abruptness of his dismissal sent a ripple of murmurs through the courtroom. Jessica remained at the podium for a moment, her legal training warring with her personal indignation. As she turned to leave, she noticed a young law student in the gallery furiously taking notes, clearly disturbed by what she'd just witnessed. Walking toward the clerk's office, Jessica's phone buzzed in her pocket. The message preview caught her eye. Emergency meeting. All judicial administrators required. 2 p.m. today. She allowed herself a small smile as she paid her fine, knowing that sometimes the universe had its own way of balancing the scales of justice. Receipt for your records, ma'am, the clerk said, sliding the paper across the counter. Jessica tucked it carefully into her briefcase, already mentally preparing for the afternoon meeting that would prove more significant than Judge Miller could possibly imagine. The courthouse elevator doors closed with a soft ding as Jessica checked her phone again. The email from Chief Justice Eleanor Martinez demanded immediate attention. Emergency meeting. Judicial performance review. Confidential. Attached was a file containing her unexpected promotion to head of judicial operations, effective immediately. Jessica leaned against the elevator wall, letting the significance of the moment sink in. After 15 years of dedicated service, the position she'd worked toward had suddenly landed in her lap, triggered by her predecessor's unexpected retirement. The timing seemed almost theatrical. Hold the elevator, a voice called out. Jessica instinctively pressed the open button, and Martha Reynolds, her longtime colleague from administrative services, rushed in. Jessica, did you see the email? Martha asked, slightly out of breath. Congratulations, though I must say, the timing is interesting. Judge Harrison's retirement wasn't supposed to be announced until next month. Thanks, Martha. I'm still processing it myself, Jessica replied, straightening her blazer. Any insight into why they moved up the timeline? Martha lowered her voice, despite them being alone in the elevator. Word is they're concerned about some of the recent judicial appointments. The Chief Justice wants a thorough review, especially of the newer judges. Apparently, there have been some complaints about courtroom conduct. The elevator stopped at the 3rd floor, and they stepped out into the administrative wing. Jessica's mind raced through the implications of her new role. She'd need to review all recently appointed judges, including Judge Miller, whose courtroom she just left. In her office, Jessica settled behind her desk and opened her laptop. The promotion packet contained her first assignment, Lead the performance review meeting at 2 p.m. She had less than 2 hours to prepare for a session that would evaluate 5 recently appointed judges. As she reviewed the files, patterns emerged. Complaints about rushed judgments, interrupting defendants, and dismissive behavior appeared repeatedly in Judge Miller's feedback. Jessica pulled up the courthouse's electronic records, accessing video footage from his recent sessions, including her own hearing from earlier. "Ms. Rodriguez," Jessica called to her assistant through the intercom, "could you please ensure the conference room is prepared for the 2 p.m. meeting? We'll need the video equipment set up." "Already on it," Lisa Rodriguez responded. And Jessica, "The Chief Justice asked me to remind you that this promotion gives you full authority to implement any necessary changes. She specifically mentioned the importance of addressing any concerns about judicial conduct." Jessica spent the next hour preparing her presentation, including statistical analysis of case handling times, defendant treatment patterns, and appeal rates. The data told a story of systemic issues that needed addressing, particularly among newer appointments. At 1:45 p.m., she gathered her materials and headed to the conference room. The polished mahogany table gleamed under overhead lights, name placards marking each seat. Judge Miller's place was directly across from hers, a seating arrangement she hadn't planned but found oddly appropriate. As she set up her presentation, Jessica thought about the morning's court session. She'd experienced firsthand the behavior that had prompted complaints from other citizens. Now, in a twist of fate, she held the authority to address these issues directly. The clock struck 1:55 p.m., and footsteps approached the conference room. Jessica took her seat at the head of the table, feeling the weight of her new responsibility. The next few minutes would reshape the power dynamic in ways Judge Miller never saw coming. The conference room filled steadily as judges and administrators filed in for the 2 p.m. meeting. Jessica arranged her documents with practiced precision, noting how conversations hushed as people noticed her sitting at the head of the table. Most knew her as a capable administrator, but few were aware of her recent promotion. Judge Miller strode in at exactly 2 p.m., his black robe exchanged for a tailored navy suit. He carried himself with the same authority he'd displayed in the courtroom, nodding to his colleagues as he searched for his name card. The confident smile playing at the corners of his mouth froze when he spotted his assigned seat, directly across from Jessica. For a moment, he stood motionless, his hand gripping the back of his chair. Recognition flickered across his face as he connected the professional woman before him with the defendant he'd dismissed so curtly just hours ago. The color drained from his face, making his blue tie seem suddenly too bright against his white shirt. "Good afternoon, everyone," Jessica began, her voice carrying the perfect blend of authority and warmth. "For those who haven't heard, Chief Justice Martinez has appointed me as the new head of judicial operations, effective immediately. Please, take your seats." Judge Miller sank into his chair, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning dew. Jessica noticed his hands trembling slightly as he opened his leather portfolio, desperately trying to appear composed. "Today's agenda focuses on reviewing recent judicial performance metrics," Jessica continued, clicking to her first presentation slide. "We'll be examining courtroom conduct, case handling efficiency, and citizen feedback across all departments." The projection screen illuminated with graphs and statistics. Judge Miller's eyes widened as he recognized his courtroom statistics highlighted in several charts, showing higher rates of interrupted testimonies and elevated citizen complaints compared to his peers. "Judge Miller," Jessica addressed him directly, her tone professional but firm, "your morning session videos have provided some interesting insights. Would you mind sharing your thoughts on appropriate defendant interaction times?" The room grew silent. Everyone turned to look at Judge Miller, who struggled to maintain his composure. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead as he realized Jessica had likely reviewed the footage of their earlier encounter. I believe in maintaining efficient courtroom proceedings," he managed to say, his voice lacking its usual authority. "But I'm always open to constructive feedback on my methods." "Excellent," Jessica responded, clicking to the next slide. because we have several video examples to discuss, including one from this morning that perfectly illustrates our concerns about rushed judgments and interrupted testimonies. The blood drained further from Judge Miller's face as the screen showed a still image from their morning encounter. Other judges shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing the implications of this review. Our goal, Jessica continued, her voice steady and professional, is to ensure every citizen receives fair and respectful treatment in our courts, regardless of who they are or what position they hold in society. She paused, making eye contact with each person around the table. When her gaze met Judge Miller's, he quickly looked down at his notes, his earlier arrogance replaced by a profound understanding of how drastically his professional world had just shifted. Now, Jessica said, clicking to the next slide, let's discuss our new guidelines for judicial conduct and citizen interaction. Judge Miller, since you've provided us with such a timely example, perhaps you'd like to start the discussion. The tension in the conference room could have been cut with a knife as Judge Miller cleared his throat, attempting to gather his thoughts. Jessica maintained perfect composure, her expression neutral yet attentive as she waited for his response. In reviewing this morning's footage, Judge Miller began hesitantly. I recognize there may have been opportunities for more thorough consideration of the defendant's statement. His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken acknowledgement. Jessica nodded professionally. Thank you for that observation, Judge Miller. Let's examine some specific timestamps. She clicked through her presentation, displaying a series of courtroom interactions. Notice how in these instances, defendants were interrupted an average of 3 times during their testimonies. The room watched as Jessica methodically presented case after case, her analysis both thorough and unflinching. She never once mentioned their personal encounter, yet the morning's traffic court session loomed large in everyone's minds. Our citizen feedback surveys, she continued, pulling up a new chart, indicate a 47% decrease in public trust when judges interrupt testimonies more than twice. This directly impacts our court's effectiveness and reputation. Martha Reynolds, sitting near the end of the table, raised her hand. What measures do you propose to address these concerns, Mrs. Thompson? Jessica stood, walking slowly around the table as she spoke. I'm implementing a new evaluation system, effective immediately. Each judge will receive monthly feedback based on courtroom recordings, citizen surveys, and peer reviews. She paused behind Judge Miller's chair, noting how he stiffened slightly at her proximity. Additionally, she continued, returning to her seat, we're introducing mandatory monthly workshops on effective communication and implicit bias recognition. These sessions will be led by experts in judicial conduct and public service. Judge Miller's pen moved across his notepad, his handwriting notably less steady than usual. Around the table, other judges exchanged glances, clearly processing the implications of these new measures. Mrs. Thompson, Judge Miller spoke up, his voice carrying a hint of newfound humility. Would you be open to individual consultations as we implement these changes? Jessica's response was measured and professional. My door is always open, Judge Miller. In fact, I believe your insights from this morning's session could prove valuable in developing our new guidelines. The subtle reminder of their earlier encounter caused Judge Miller to loosen his tie slightly, but Jessica smoothly moved the discussion forward. Let's review the proposed timeline for these implementations. As she outlined the new procedures, Jessica noticed several judges taking detailed notes, while others nodded in agreement. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from initial tension to focused attention. Before we conclude, Jessica announced, I want to emphasize that these changes aren't punitive. They're opportunities for growth and improvement in our service to the public. We're all capable of learning and adapting, regardless of our position or experience. The meeting wrapped up with a clear action plan. As people gathered their materials to leave, Judge Miller remained seated, staring at his notes. Jessica organized her presentation materials, giving him space to process the afternoon's revelations. Mrs. Thompson, he finally said, approaching her as others filed out, Might I have a few minutes of your time tomorrow morning? Jessica checked her calendar deliberately before responding. 7:30 a.m., before court sessions begin. We can discuss your questions over coffee in my office. Judge Miller nodded, understanding the significance of this offer. As he turned to leave, his shoulders carried the weight of a man who had just received a masterclass in professional grace and the responsibility that comes with authority. The courthouse had grown quiet as evening settled in, with only the soft hum of the cleaning crew's vacuum in the distance. Judge Miller sat alone in his chambers, his tie loosened, jacket draped over his chair. The wall clock showed 8:45 p.m., but he couldn't bring himself to leave, not yet. His computer monitor displayed the paused footage from that morning's traffic court session. He'd already watched it 7 times, each viewing revealing something new about his behavior that made him increasingly uncomfortable. His prestigious law degree from Yale, hanging prominently on the wall, seemed to mock him in the dim light. "Play it again," he muttered to himself, clicking the replay button. This time, he focused solely on his body language. How he barely looked up when Jessica approached the podium. The dismissive wave of his hand. The way he cut her off mid-sentence. He reached for his leather-bound notebook, the one his mother had given him when he passed the bar exam. "Remember," she'd said, "true justice requires an open mind and a humble heart." He began writing observations about his conduct. Asterisk never made eye contact. Asterisk interrupted testimony repeatedly. Asterisk showed visible impatience. Asterisk dismissed evidence without consideration. Asterisk added court costs without justification. Asterisk. The list grew longer as he continued watching the footage. In one corner of his screen, he noticed a young law intern's shocked expression as he dismissed Jessica's case. That same intern had approached him earlier today, quietly withdrawing her request to clerk for him next semester. Judge Miller paused the video again, this time on a frame showing Jessica's composed face as she attempted to present her case. The same face that, hours later, would command the conference room with such dignified authority. He remembered the shame that had washed over him when he realized who she was, but now, in the quiet of his chambers, he recognized that the shame should have come from his behavior itself, not the consequence of it. Rising from his desk, he walked to his window overlooking the city. Streetlights twinkled below, and he could see people heading home after long days at work. How many of them had stood before him in court? How many had he treated with the same dismissive attitude he'd shown Jessica? His phone buzzed. A text from his teenage daughter. "Dad, can you help me with my civics homework? It's about equal treatment under the law." The irony wasn't lost on him. Here was his daughter, studying the very principles he'd failed to uphold today. He typed back a quick response, promising to help her when he got home, knowing he'd learned more about equal treatment in the past 12 hours than in his entire career. Returning to his desk, Judge Miller opened a new document and began typing. His court clerk would probably be surprised to receive revised procedural guidelines at this hour, but he couldn't wait until morning. The changes were simple but significant. Mandatory eye contact with all defendants. Full testimony allowed without interruption. Written justification required for maximum fines. Regular review of courtroom footage for self-evaluation. As he typed, he thought about his upcoming meeting with Jessica. His carefully prepared excuses now seemed hollow in the face of his own recorded behavior. She had shown more professionalism in handling his shortcomings than he had demonstrated in his entire morning session. The cleaning crew's vacuum grew closer. Judge Miller saved his document and finally reached for his jacket, knowing tomorrow would require something more than just apologies. It would demand real change, starting with himself. The local coffee shop across from the courthouse buzzed with early morning energy. Jessica sat at a corner table, watching steam rise from her cappuccino as she reviewed emails on her tablet. At precisely 7:30 a.m., Judge Miller walked in, looking notably different from his usual polished self. He'd chosen to wear a charcoal gray suit instead of his typical power suits, and his demeanor carried none of yesterday's superiority. After ordering a black coffee, he approached Jessica's table with measured steps. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that had been absent in court. "Thank you for meeting me." Jessica gestured to the chair across from her. "Good morning, Judge Miller. Please, call me Jessica." She closed her tablet, giving him her full attention. The morning sunlight streamed through the cafe's windows, casting a gentle glow across their table. A barista called out orders in the background, creating a comfortable buffer of ambient noise. "Jessica," he began, wrapping his hands around his coffee cup, "I spent most of last night reviewing my courtroom footage. Not just yesterday's session, but weeks of recordings." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "What I saw was uncomfortable to watch." Jessica listened quietly, noting how different he seemed from the man who had dismissed her so readily in court. "I've prepared a list of procedural changes for my courtroom," he continued, pulling a folder from his briefcase. "But before I share them, I owe you a sincere apology. My behavior yesterday, and frankly for quite some time, has been beneath the standards of this office." A young lawyer from their courthouse walked past their table, doing a double take at seeing them together. Jessica smiled politely as Judge Miller continued. "I realized something last night," he said, his coffee untouched. "When my daughter texted me about her civics homework, equal treatment under the law, I couldn't even bring myself to help her. How could I explain principles I wasn't upholding myself?" Jessica leaned forward slightly. "That's a powerful realization, Brandon," she said, using his first name deliberately. "Self-awareness is the first step toward meaningful change. My mother was a paralegal," he shared unexpectedly. "She worked twice as hard to earn half the respect. I watched her struggle, yet somehow I became part of the same system that made her life difficult." The morning crowd thinned as the coffee shop's rush hour wound down. Their conversation continued, touching on experiences, challenges, and hopes for improvement in the justice system. "I'd like to volunteer to lead some of the training sessions we discussed yesterday," Judge Miller offered. "Not as an expert, but as someone who's recognized the need for change. My experience could serve as a practical example." Jessica nodded approvingly. That kind of vulnerability from a senior judge could make a significant impact, especially on newer appointees. As their meeting drew to a close, Judge Miller reached for his untouched, cold coffee. "One more thing," he said, pulling out his wallet. "I'd like to refund your fine and court costs. It wasn't a fair hearing." Jessica held up her hand. "Keep it in the system," she said with a knowing smile, "but direct it to the courthouse's new bias training program fund. Let's make sure something good comes from this." Standing to leave, Judge Miller extended his hand. "Thank you, Jessica, not just for this meeting, but for handling yesterday's revelation with such grace. You've taught me more about justice in the past 24 hours than my entire career on the bench." As they walked out of the coffee shop, both heading to their respective offices, they knew this morning's conversation had laid the groundwork for lasting change in their courthouse. 6 months later, the courthouse buzzed with a different kind of energy. The morning sun filtered through the newly installed transparent barriers, symbolic of the changes that had transformed the building's culture. Jessica stood at the back of courtroom 304, quietly observing as Judge Miller handled his morning session. "Please, take your time to explain your situation," he said to an elderly gentleman at the podium, his tone patient and encouraging. The difference in his courtroom demeanor was striking. Gone was the dismissive attitude, replaced by genuine attention and respect. In the gallery, a group of newly appointed judges sat taking notes. Judge Miller's courtroom had become a model for the district's new judicial training program, ironically titled the Thompson-Miller Protocol for Judicial Excellence. After the session, Jessica met with the Chief Justice in her office, surrounded by charts showing the dramatic improvements in public satisfaction and trust scores. "The transformation has been remarkable," Chief Justice Martinez commented, reviewing the latest statistics. "Complaint rates down 70%, public approval up 85%, and we've had requests from 3 neighboring districts to implement your training program." Jessica smiled, remembering the unexpected chain of events that had led to these changes. Judge Miller deserves much of the credit, she replied. His willingness to share his experience has made other judges more receptive to change. At that moment, a knock on the door preceded Martha Reynolds, who entered with fresh data from the quarterly review. "You're going to want to see this," she said excitedly. "The state Supreme Court has noticed our improvements. They're considering making our program a requirement for all new judicial appointments statewide." Later that afternoon, Jessica walked through the courthouse lobby, now adorned with a newly installed message: "Equal justice under law. Every voice deserves to be heard." She noticed Judge Miller speaking with a young law student, the same one who had withdrawn her clerkship application 6 months ago. Now she was eagerly signing papers to begin her internship. "Mrs. Thompson," Judge Miller called out, excusing himself from the student. "Have you seen the latest feedback from yesterday's training session?" They fell into step together, walking toward the courthouse cafe. "The personal story you shared about your mother really resonated with the new appointees," Jessica commented. "It's powerful when they see that even experienced judges can learn and grow." "Speaking of growth," he replied, "my daughter got an A+ on her civics project about our program. She's talking about law school now." His pride was evident, but different from the arrogance he'd shown half a year ago. As they reached the cafe, they noticed a familiar face: Officer Parker, the one who had issued Jessica's ticket. He was attending one of the newly mandatory sensitivity training sessions for court officers and law enforcement. Sometimes, Jessica mused, watching the officer engage in a role-playing exercise, the most significant changes come from unexpected moments. Judge Miller nodded thoughtfully. "You know, I keep that traffic ticket framed in my chambers. It reminds me that true justice requires more than just knowing the law. It requires understanding people." As the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the courthouse windows, Jessica reflected on how a simple traffic stop had catalyzed such meaningful change. The courthouse had become more than just a building where laws were enforced. It had transformed into a place where justice was served with dignity, respect, and understanding. "Ready for tomorrow's joint presentation to the State Judicial Committee?" Judge Miller asked as they parted ways. Jessica smiled confidently. "Ready. After all, every good story deserves to be shared, especially when it leads to positive change."